Tonight, you will pick up a fork without thinking about it. You will spear a piece of food and lift it to your mouth. It will feel as automatic as blinking, as unremarkable as the air moving through the room around you. But that motion, so small it barely counts as a decision, would have gotten you accused of something close to demonic possession less than 1,000 years ago. Somewhere, a monk once looked at a woman eating with a two-pronged metal tool and saw an insult to God. Not an exaggeration, not a joke. A real man, in a real sermon, argued that her fingers were the utensils her creator had already given her, and that anything else was vanity dressed up as dinner. He didn't stop there. He suggested the tool itself carried something unnatural about it, a small act of defiance against the body she'd been handed at birth. She died young, not long after. He said it was punishment. Strange, isn't it, that a piece of bent metal could carry that much weight? But it did. And to understand why, you have to go back much further than a Venetian wedding feast. You probably assume ancient humans were the ones without manners, sitting in the dirt, tearing meat with bare hands, grunting between bites. But the truth is almost the exact opposite. For nearly the entire span of human existence, eating with your hands wasn't primitive. It was simply eating. There was no other option, and no one thought there needed to be one. Go back far enough, and you land before fire. Before light, in the sense your ancestors would have understood it. Before flame pushed back the dark at the edge of a cave. In that world, a group of early hominins, in what is now Ethiopia, were already shaping stone into sharp edges. Paleoanthropologist Sileshi Sema excavated tools from a site called Gona, dated to roughly 2.6 million years old. The oldest deliberately shaped tools ever found. These weren't forks. They weren't even close. They were flakes struck off a stone core, sharp enough to slice hide and scrape meat from bone. Picture it. No language yet, not in any form you'd recognize. No shelter beyond whatever rock or tree offered cover. Just a hand holding a sharpened stone, cutting into a carcass scavenged or hunted, working fast before something bigger came to take it. That stone did real work. It opened up meat no tooth alone could manage. But once the cutting stopped, the stone went down. The hand took over completely, carrying each piece to the mouth the same way it always had. Here's the strange part. Those tools were never meant to touch a mouth. They were prep tools, butchery tools. Once the meat was cut, the hand finished the job. That division held for millions of years. Cut with stone, eat with fingers. Two separate jobs that never merged into one utensil. Why would they? Hands already worked. They still do. Somewhere in that unbroken stretch of time, humans learned to control fire. Cooking changed digestion, changed jaw structure, changed the shape of the human face over generations. Food got softer, easier to tear, easier to swallow. But none of that changed how food traveled from the fire to the mouth. It still went by hand, lifted straight off a hot rock or out of a shared pot, fingers quickly learning to tolerate heat that would have seemed unbearable to anyone who hadn't grown up around flame. Light came, warmth came, cooked meals came, and still no fork. Not for a very, very long time. The first real departure wasn't a fork at all. It was a spoon, and it barely counts as an invention. A curved shell, a hollowed stone, something already shaped by nature that a hungry person picked up because it happened to hold liquid. No one sat down and designed the spoon the way you design a tool from scratch. Someone simply noticed that a certain shell scooped broth better than fingers ever could, and kept using it. That's how casually the earliest eating tool arrived into human life. Not genius. Convenience. Repeated until it became habit. Chopsticks came next, and even they didn't start as eating tools. Historian Q. Edward Wang, who has spent years studying their origins, points to a Neolithic site in Jiangsu, China, where archaeologists uncovered bone sticks dating back roughly 8,500 years. But one's research shows those early sticks were almost certainly used for cooking, for reaching into a fire or a boiling pot, not for lifting food to a face. It took thousands more years, well into the Han dynasty, before chopsticks made that leap from kitchen tool to table tool, helped along by food that was already sliced small enough for two thin sticks to manage. The spoon, Wang notes, came first and mattered more. It was the real workhorse of ancient dining, long before anything resembling a fork existed anywhere on Earth. So when did the fork show up? Not in the Stone Age. Not in ancient Egypt, where forks did exist but stayed in the kitchen, used only for cooking and carving meat, never for eating it. Not in Rome. The personal, pronged, handheld eating fork doesn't appear in the historical record until the Byzantine Empire. And even there, it stayed a rare, aristocratic curiosity for centuries. Something closer to a novelty than a tool anyone expected to spread. Then, in the year 104, a Byzantine noblewoman named Maria Argyropoulina traveled to Venice to marry the son of the Doge. She brought a small case of golden forks with her. At her wedding feast, instead of touching her food, she had servants cut it into pieces, then lifted each piece to her mouth on a two-pronged golden spike, never once letting her fingers make contact with the meal in front of her. The Venetians had never seen anything like it. And they did not approve. Food historian B. Wilson has written about what happened next. A clergyman named Peter Damian watched the display and was disturbed by it, not fascinated. To him, the fork wasn't clever. It was an act of pride, a refusal to accept the body God had built, hands included. When Maria died of the plague just 2 years later, Damian preached that her death was divine punishment for that vanity, for choosing a metal instrument over the fingers she'd been given. His sermon effectively froze the fork out of European dining for the next 400 years. Think about that number. 400 years. A tool this small, this unthreatening by every modern standard, delayed by a single sermon and the discomfort it captured. Not because the fork was dangerous, not because it was impractical, because it looked like arrogance. It looked like a person deciding their hands, their God-given body, weren't good enough anymore for something as simple as dinner. Why would something so minor provoke that kind of fear? Maybe because for nearly the whole of human history, eating with your hands wasn't a habit you fell back on. It was intimacy. It was the most direct possible contact between a person and their food, unmediated by anything manufactured, unchanged since the first ancestor closed a fist around a piece of meat in the dark. Introducing a tool into that relationship wasn't neutral. It was a statement. It said, I am separating myself from the raw experience of eating. I am adding distance, adding refinement, adding a barrier between my body and my meal. To some people, watching that happen for the first time, it looked less like progress and more like rejection. It took the fork centuries to recover from that reputation. Italy warmed to it first, slowly through the 1500s. Mostly among the wealthy who wanted their meals to look as controlled and composed as everything else about their status. France resisted it as effeminate and unnecessary for even longer, with critics insisting a real appetite didn't need a middleman. England held out until the 1700s, and even then, plenty of households considered a knife and a steady hand more than sufficient. The fork's global takeover, the one you probably assumed was ancient and universal, is actually one of the youngest habits in the entire history of eating. Younger than gunpowder. Younger than the printing press. And here's the twist most people never learn. It still isn't universal. Right now, an enormous share of the world's population, roughly 4 in every 10 people, eats primarily with their hands. Not out of poverty, not out of ignorance, out of tradition, climate, texture, and a completely different relationship with food than the one the fork eventually built in the West. In large parts of India, the Middle East, and Africa, hands remain the utensil, exactly as they were for your ancestors, before light, before fire, before any of this began. In many of those places, eating with a fork is considered the strange choice, the one that puts unnecessary distance between a person and their meal. This isn't a story about dirt, either, no matter what modern assumptions might whisper. Cultures that eat with their hands generally developed careful rituals around it long before forks existed anywhere. Water poured over fingers before a meal, water poured again after. Specific fingers reserved for specific tasks so that only the clean tips of the right hand ever touch food meant to be shared. None of that looks like carelessness. It looks like a system, refined over centuries, built around the assumption that hands were always going to be the tool, so the tool had better be kept respectable. So, consider the quiet judgment that sometimes creeps in when you watch someone eat with their hands at a table. That reflex, the assumption that it's somehow less refined, less clean, less civilized. That reflex isn't ancient wisdom passed down through the ages. It's a cultural habit that's barely a few centuries deep, traceable in part to a monk's 11th century sermon about a dead princess and her golden fork, a sermon that managed to flip the entire moral direction of the argument. What once looked sinful now looks standard. What once looked standard now sometimes gets treated as strange. Your body doesn't know the difference between a fork and a finger. It never did. For 2.6 million years, it didn't need to. The fork isn't the natural endpoint of human progress, the shining destination every civilization was quietly building toward. It's a recent, oddly controversial detour. One that spent 400 years being treated as an insult to God before anyone agreed to let it back on the table. Tonight, when you pick up that fork without thinking about it, you won't be repeating some ancient instinct passed down since the first fire lit the first cave. You'll be repeating something far younger, something your ancestors from Beforelight would not recognize at all. And somewhere back along that impossibly long line of hands, reaching for food in the dark, none of them would have understood why you needed anything more than what you were already born with.